medieval barbarism. That's what it was. It was an act of inhuman savagery of the kind that you don't normally see, even on the streets of Belfast. The lethally gullible officials up in Belfast granted him leave to remain. So that turns this from an act of savagery into a political scandal.
If people feel anxious from an ethnic or racial perspective, now it may well be possible that they don't really see Reform UK as a party for them. They might want something which is, well, I mean, some people will say far right, but they might want an option which is more hardline.
You know, you've got people being killed on the streets of Britain, and you've got riots, and you've got all sorts going on, and he just says, I'm going to ban social media, don't worry, I'll do it. You know, there could be a nuclear war, and he'd come out with a statement about social media.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm thrilled today to be joined down the line by Brendan O'Neill, Spike's chief political writer. Welcome, Brendan.
How's it going?
And Spike columnist Rakib Ehsan. Welcome, Rakib.
Hello.
So we've got plenty to discuss today. We'll be talking about why Belfast is burning, the battle for the right in Makerfield, and Labour's coming crackdown on social media. But before we get into all that, I have a very exciting announcement. The Spiked Summit, our biggest ever event, has officially sold out. All of the tickets are gone. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you all there. All of you who have a ticket, we'll see you on Saturday, the 27th of June in central London. But don't despair if you haven't had time to get a ticket, if you haven't been able to get your hands on one. We do have a waiting list. So if you're really desperate to come, just drop us a line at supporters@spiked-online.com. That's supporters@spiked-online.com, and we will put you on the waiting list. So rioting has erupted in Belfast over the past couple of days. We've seen cars and buses set alight. We've seen people throwing paving stones and bricks at police officers. Most chilling of all, we've seen people going door to door in masks looking for foreigners. We've seen people's homes set on fire. All of this was sparked by a really, really horrific and brutal attack earlier this week. A Sudanese national has been charged on suspicion of attempted murder. There's a viral video appearing to show someone trying to behead and gouge the eyes out of an innocent passerby. And it's a video that has really, really shocked the nation and caused an understandable amount of anger. Brendan, shall we start off talking about the crime and the circumstances around it? Because I think a lot of people are just thinking, how the hell is this allowed to happen in the UK in the 21st century?
Yeah, it's barbaric, and you can understand why it's caused so much alarm, so much anger, so much disgust, you know, across the United Kingdom and across Ireland as well. People are really horrified by what they saw on that viral footage. You know, seems to show, as you say, this suspect. The suspect is reportedly from Sudan, just stabbing time and time again this man on the street who he has pinned down. The man reportedly lost one of his eyes. It seems that this was an attempted eye gouging, maybe even an attempted beheading. I mean, medieval barbarism, that's what it was. It was an act of inhuman savagery of the kind that you don't normally see, even on the streets of Belfast, which has had its fair share of violence over the past few decades. This is something new, something different, and something deeply, deeply disturbing. You know, the point I would make about it is that the thing that elevates this from just a grotesque atrocity allegedly carried out by this suspect, the thing that elevates it from that into a political storm is the fact that this man seems to be from Sudan. The reports are that he went through Paris and then flew into Dublin, seemed to have waltzed out of Dublin airport and got a bus to Belfast, and then just claimed asylum. And he was, you know, the lethally gullible officials up in Belfast granted him leave to remain. So that turns this from an act of savagery into a political scandal, because behind this act, it would seem that there is a whole regime of complicity. There is a whole system of failure, state failure, a failure to police our borders, a failure to keep a check on who's coming into the country and why, a failure to keep away unvetted men who might be undesirable, as this man clearly seems to be. It is that failure that I think aided and abetted this atrocity. So only that man is responsible for what supposedly happened on that street. but he was witlessly aided and abetted by a failing state and by an activist class that derives this great sense of virtue from saying refugees welcome, migrants welcome, etc., etc. So this is a story about the collapse of the British state, and I think that's why it's really got people angry.
Absolutely. And Rakib, I mean, there are some really specific and strange failures in this case. I mean, we've since learned that the suspect had his asylum application fast tracked and didn't have to even do an interview in order to be granted asylum in the UK. I mean, what have you made of that?
Well, I think it's absolutely remarkable that we can even create a fast track scheme when it comes to handling such sensitive asylum claims. Now, under the Sunak government, there was a fast track scheme which was created ultimately in an attempt to drive down what it was called the legacy backlog. And in 2023, what Brendan has already talked about, the suspect in this case traveled from Paris to Dublin, which is very easy under the EU's freedom of movement principle. And then reportedly he took a bus from Dublin to Belfast, also very easy because the common travel area arrangements. But what is especially astonishing that in the very same year it's reported that he submitted an asylum claim that very year, and before the granting of refugee status, not even a face-to-face interview, reportedly under this streamlined procedure, just a 10-page questionnaire. Now, without a face-to-face interview, what kind of psychological evaluation can be made? How strong is the security vetting process there? So Brendan's absolutely right. This is a fundamental state failure, but it's not the first one. And unfortunately, I suspect it's not going to be the last one either. So I think, of course, we could say that this is a abhorrently violent attack. But I think we have to really look at how the state has failed in not just this case, it seems, but in many cases, and how this effort to drive down this legacy backlog when it comes to asylum claims, how that effort has resulted in ultimately undermining the security of local communities.
Yeah, and Rakib, could you just speak to that a little bit more? That this is not an isolated incident, as some people would like to portray it. There is an extraordinary number of quite horrific crimes that have been committed or allegedly committed, that are linked to so-called asylum seekers. I mean, some of the rape on Brighton Beach is a recent one that comes to mind, but there are so many others. It feels like there's a new one every week that we learn about.
No, absolutely. I think there's been a wave of sexual crimes involving asylum seekers, especially those who originate from Afghanistan, which, according to the Georgetown Institute's Women, Peace and Security Index, Afghanistan finishes bottom out of 181 countries. So I think that what we have a totally dysfunctional asylum system, which has, as I said, it's ultimately weakened public safety. And now it seems across all four home nations. And I think that now, of course, we condemn the violence which has taken place after that horrific attack. But we have to realize we've become tinderbox UK. And I think that a big part of maintaining healthy community relations is having a highly selective immigration system and ultimately an asylum regime, which I've often argued for, which is also highly selective, which prioritizes women and girls who are at risk of sexual violence in their homelands and insecure displacement camps. At the moment, we have the exact opposite of that. And I think that that will lead to very serious problems. And I think that when it comes to handling asylum claims, now you can talk about how you can make those processes more efficient in terms of decision making, but you should never compromise security vetting procedures in an effort to do that.
Absolutely. And Brendan, I mean, let's talk about some of the scenes in Belfast. As they are deplorable, of course, but as Rakib says, we are in a very combustible situation. It feels like how many more atrocities can people take?
Yeah, the scenes are really depressing and obscene. The worst aspect is the reports that people have been going to the houses of non-native people and setting them on fire or trying to drive people out of their homes. Completely unacceptable behavior. Everyone, I think, all normal people agree with that. I was in Belfast last week, as it happens, and one thing I was thinking was how much of a wonderful, peaceful city it is now after decades of actual war. And then you have something like this. Firstly, the attempted beheading, and then the ugly disturbances that we've seen since. So incredibly sad and regrettable and condemnable. But the thing that's making me almost physically sick at the moment is the state's hypocritical condemnation of the behavior in Belfast, because they lit the flames for this. It is so disgusting that they pour petrol on a local community and then say, oh God, where did all this fire come from? They're trying to absolve themselves of responsibility for the culture that they've created. And what they've done quite explicitly, and working class people are not stupid, they know that this is what's happened. They have sacrificed ordinary communities at the altar of globalism, at the altar of this kind of bourgeois virtue, which says, borders are a thing of the past. Let everyone come in. We have to look after the wretched of the world. We have to bring in people from Afghanistan, Sudan. It doesn't matter whether you disagree with us. It doesn't matter whether your communities suffer as a consequence of this influx of largely young men. None of that matters. We're going to do it anyway. Screw you. That's essentially what the state has said to communities in Belfast and across the UK over the past few years. It's almost as if you have this kind of activist class and this political class in their leafy suburbs who yap their slogans about caring for migrants and so on, and they never have to deal with the consequences of this influx of people from countries that are very different to our own. Let's be honest about this. The people who have to deal with the consequences of that are, the girl in a working class town who suddenly has 800 men from God knows where in the hotel at the end of the street. Or people in Belfast who suddenly have this man from Sudan behaving in the way that he's behaving. They're, as I said in my Spike piece this week, it seems they're paying the blood price for bourgeois virtue. They're paying the cost of this kind of activism and political failure and institutionalized cowardice. That's what's happening. So people are very, very angry. And, the key question here is, and I say this as someone who always condemns riots, because nihilistic violence solves nothing and in fact usually makes things worse. So bear that in mind. But the question in my mind is, what can people do? They've been voting for years and years to have less immigration. They've been voting for years and years to have tougher border controls. They've been begging the political class to stop the boats. The politicians say, okay, we'll do it. They never do. They don't listen to ordinary people's concerns. They don't heed them at the ballot box. They don't do what people are asking them to do. So if voting doesn't work and protesting doesn't work, because when people have protested in Dublin and London and Belfast, peacefully protested against these problems, they're called fascists and scum and told to stay at home. That doesn't work either. People are at the end of their tether. That's what I think we see in Belfast. And that's not a justification for the violence at all. It's just an explanation of the culture that the establishment has helped to create in these volatile communities. So the hypocrisy, the sick-making hypocrisy of the elites condemning this violence when they created the conditions for it, that's really out of order.
And Rakib, it does feel as if the only thing the establishment, the politicians are interested in is sort of managing people's feelings. They talk a lot about outside agitators, the far right whipping up, fury. Even today, we had various politicians blaming Russia and China for stirring things up. And you do think, well, as lamentable and condemnable as those scenes are, people are reacting to a genuine problem. And it's the problem that needs to be solved, not people's, if there's no problem, then people have nothing to react to.
No, absolutely. I think that this is the state's tendency to externalize blame, whether there's other domestic actors, or in some cases they'll look to blame foreign regimes. There's just a real reluctance, that hesitancy to take accountability for these serious political failures. And I've said many times before that ultimately having healthy community relations, it rests on having a responsible immigration asylum policy. At the moment, we are nowhere near that. And I think that Brendan's talk about there, that when he visited Belfast, that it seemed like a very peaceful city. But I think that people are almost taking liberties with that. I think Belfast has been treated as almost some kind of dumping ground for asylum seekers from parts of the world which are culturally so different. not only when it comes to the treatment of women and girls, but also more generally in terms of just being. I mean, we could talk about Belfast's history of political violence, but we're talking about very serious levels of conflict-related violence in some of these countries. Which are very strongly related to asylum seekers who are being relocated in the UK across all four home nations. So I think that, of course, we condemn the violence which took place after this horrendous attack. But I think that what's really worrying is that, as Brendan said, that time and again, through democratic exercises, people have expressed a desire to see greater immigration control. And I think with that, a responsible asylum policy, a more hard headed approach to refugee policy. We haven't moved remotely as close to that as we should be. And I think that that is a very serious problem. And I think that anti-establishment sentiment, when you have a major incident like this, and make no mistake, this is a major incident, that can spill over into forms of public disorder. And I think that if the state doesn't get a grip of this situation, or is reluctant to do so, then there'll be plenty more to come, unfortunately.
So let's talk about the Makerfield by-election. The good people of Makerfield in Greater Manchester will get to make a decision next week. Will they effectively install Andy Burnham as Prime Minister, or will they block his path to power? There's some really interesting polling coming out, and we need to put a bit of a health warning on this polling. It's been reported in the newspaper, and the Labour Party is very keen to emphasise it, but it suggests that Restore Britain, that the party that is to the right of reform, could be on as much as 14%, which brings reform down massively and gives Andy Burnham a very significant lead. Again, these are polls, got to take it with a pinch of salt. This is private polling as well. The public polling shows a rather different picture. But nevertheless, I mean, Brendan, what do you make of this potential of the potential for Restore to be a kind of spoiler party in this by-election?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we need a pinch of salt with all of this because you read that it's 12% or it's 7%, or, I'm hoping it's more like 2% or something way down, because I find Restore Britain to be such an annoying party. I think they're the your party of the right, a bunch of cranks and idiots, and very sectarian. If you look at the leadership of the party in particular, it is pretty much singularly devoted to stopping reform. They hate Farage because Rupert Lowe, the leader of Restore, had a famous fallout with Farage, and it seems to have devoted his life now to getting one over on Farage. So the whole upper echelons of the party are obsessed with screwing up reform's chances, getting one over on Nigel Farage. That seems to be their great mission in life. And it might come off in Makerfield. They might actually put a spanner in the works of reform's rebellion and let Andy Burnham swoop into power and then potentially take over the whole country. I think it's awful behavior. I'm sure Restore has lots of good, ordinary, working class people up in Makerfield campaigning for it. So I'm not talking about those kinds of people. But if you look at the leadership of the party and its spokespeople and the kind of digital army that hangs on Rupert Lowe's every word, and they're constantly making memes of Rupert Lowe as a kind of shirtless Henry V about to go into battle with the Muslims. I mean, talk about a bunch of whack jobs. If you look at that layer of the party, it's like a game to them. It's like they're having fun. And that's what really pisses me off, because they are robbing the good working class people of Makerfield of this extraordinary gift they've been given, which is the opportunity, should they want it, to rip the crown from the King of the North, Andy Burnham, to deprive him of a seat in the Commons, to deprive Labour of any hope of maybe giving itself a bit of spit and polish and renewing itself with a new leader. The people of Makerfield have got an extraordinary opportunity to really say no to all of those elite machinations, and instead to say, we're going to take a punt on reform. Instead, we're going to stick it to the machine. We're going to stick it to the man. And Restore seems to be screwing that up for a laugh, for the memes, for, in order that they can go online and say, ha ha, look what we're doing. So it's childish sectarian politics of the kind that we normally see on the left, with your party, although they seem to have collapsed, and these kind of left-wing sects that are constantly saying, we hate Labour, we want to do this, we want to do that. So I find it incredibly annoying, and it's such a shame because Makerfield deserves to be a really important historic showdown between the old establishment and this new urge amongst ordinary people for a different kind of politics, for a more serious approach to questions about borders and immigration and history and culture, all of those things that reform are promising to address. So I just think Restore's behavior is childish, nerdish. It feels like the revenge of the nerds. He's blocking the way of ordinary working people who want to do something quite important. So yeah, I'm not a fan of what they're doing at all.
Yeah, I mean, Rakib, what do you make of it? I mean, Restore insists that they're not stealing anyone's votes. They have their own voter base. I think the polling suggests otherwise. So John Curtis has said that it is basically reform voters moving over there. It does seem strange to have such a vigorously anti-reform party on the right. I thought that was the job of the Lib Dems or the Labour Party or whatever it might be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've made the point that there's no party that has a God-given right to someone's vote at the end of the day. And I think that if there are voters who have previously flirted with reform but now looking to vote for Restore Britain, I think the question to ask is, why are they doing so? Why are they entertaining that possibility? Now, I'm saying this as a Muslim social conservative, but one possibility is that they might feel particularly anxious over the presence of Islam, the growing presence of Islam in the UK, even though Makerfield itself is quite an ethnically and religious homogenous place. I just think about looking at just society more generally, what people may have experienced in different parts of the country, or what they see is going on in terms of demographic change. And we have experienced remarkable forms of demographic change in recent times. And I think that there's something to be said that if people feel anxious from an ethnic or racial perspective, now, it may well be possible that they don't really see Reform UK as a party for them. They might want something which is, well, I mean, some people will say far right, but they might want an option which is more hardline. Now, the truth is, Restore Britain is a formal political party, and you could say it offers a pressure valve in a way for people who fall into those kind of attitudes, into that worldview. And I think I'd much rather have a formal political party as opposed to those kind of views being driven underground, or potentially people flirting with what you'd consider to be flirting with organizations which might be prescribed. You'd consider them to be genuinely extremist organizations. So I think that I understand that some people might feel frustrated because this essentially may allow Andy Burnham to get through back to the Commons through the back door. But ultimately, I'd make the point that Reform UK, in a way, I think it shot itself in the foot in a way. I think that when I saw the candidate selected by Reform UK to stand in the Makerfield by-election, on paper, Rob Kenyon, it looks pretty good. He has that unique employment history of being previously employed by the NHS and the armed forces. Those are two institutions traditionally which are very highly respected by society. But then there's some social media content that came to light. We won't get into the nitty gritty of that. I'm sure the
Apologies
people
to
who
Carol Vorderman.
apologies to Carol Vorderman. And they're just talking about a little sniff here or there. But I think the point to make is that I just see it as this. There's parties there which are throwing their hat in the ring. Voters have more political options now, and I think that we have a very fragmented electoral marketplace, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And as I said, that many people said, this is depriving Reform UK of a historic victory. Well, then maybe they need to adopt a different approach then in order to win the by-election. I think that's maybe something to be said. So overall, I don't necessarily have that dimmer view of Restore Britain potentially depriving Reform UK of a historic victory in the Makerfield by-election. And I just think that ultimately, I think it's just good that voters now have more political choices on the table nowadays.
Brendan, should we talk a little bit about Andy Burnham? I mean, he wants to be the next Prime Minister. He has run a very local campaign, at least in the last week or so. It feels as if he was making all kinds of pronouncements on national issues and pretty much all of them U-turns, let's be honest, and has now kind of fallen out of the limelight, not really had anything to say about Belfast or Henry Novak or any of the big issues. Most recently, he's U-turned on the question of the waspy women, the women who say that they lost their pensions because they lost a letter in the post or something, decades ago. But Burnham just feels like nothingness. It just doesn't feel like much of a solution to Britain's problems. I doubt even a solution to Labour's problems.
Yeah, I agree. He's, there's not much to him, is there? And it tends to be the kind of SW1 crowd who go all goggle-eyed for him. And they're the ones who think he's the king of the North. They're the one who thinks he's Mr. Manchester. He's done wonders up there and he's going to, transform the country if he gets into power. The fandom around Andy Burnham in the kind of Westminster bubble is really creepy, I think. And you do get the sense that they almost see the Makerfield by-election as a coronation for Burnham. Of course he should just waltz in and get this seat and then waltz into Downing Street and so on. I think a lot of people in Makerfield are thinking, and this came up on the Makerfield question time the other week, a lot of people there are thinking, well, he's just using our constituency in order to further his own career and to become, get to the top of the greasy pole. And it's pretty clear that's what he's doing. He blows with the wind, doesn't he? He changes. 1 minute he's a Blairite, next minute he's a bit more socialistic, the next minute he's, cuddling up with private enterprise, and then he's saying I'm socialism light. Manchesterism is the way forward. You don't know which way he's going to point tomorrow. It changes constantly, and then he changes his mind on things like gender self-ID, for example. He now recognizes that's a more controversial position than it might have been a few years ago. I think he deserves to be called out on a lot of the stuff that he's done, and the media isn't doing that sufficiently, I think. So, for example, in Manchester, he is seen as not having handled the rape gang scandal very well at all, and in fact having kicked it into the long grass for too long, and people are worried about how he handled that. His attempt to bring in a kind of ULEZ style scheme in Manchester was incredibly unpopular. Some of us will remember that after the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017, he couldn't even bring himself to say the word Islamist. He just kept saying extremist. He wouldn't name the ideology that had just slaughtered 22 young Mancunians. In my view, not a serious politician, and certainly not the politician we need right now, which is someone who is willing to say something about the Henry Novak scandal, or the Belfast situation, or the migrant crisis, or the Islamist threat. All these things that need to be spoken about clearly and frankly. He's not the man to do that job. So, in a sense, I'm not that worried if he does sweep into power. I mean, I would prefer that he didn't, because I just think it would be so historic and hilarious if the people of Makerfield prevented him from doing this. But I'm not that worried if he does, because Labour's problem is not just Keir Starmer. Labour's problem is Labour. It's a party that was founded to represent working class people, but which now looks down its nose at them, which looks at them as gammon who screwed up the country with their vote for Brexit, and they're all a little bit racist. And, maybe Labour should cozy up to the middle classes and the public sector workers instead. So Labour has a historic crisis, an existential crisis. Andy Burnham might offset that for a couple of years by being a new face, but fundamentally he won't fix it.
Let's talk a bit about Labour's planned social media crackdowns. The Labour Party, Keir Starmer, have mooted a series of policies. Many of them aimed at children, but not all of them. So earlier this week, we heard it being floated that phones will all be scanned for nude images to prevent children from sending and receiving naked pictures. I'm sure that people are not opposed to to some censorship on that level. There's talk of banning harmful social media platforms to under 16s. It's not clear which ones are deemed harmful and which ones are not. But also in the context of Belfast, we've seen Hilary Benn, the Northern Ireland Secretary, and Liz Kendall, the Technology Secretary, suggesting that there will need to be more rapid response to taking down fake news and content that incites violence in times of crisis. I mean, of course, it's a different situation for teenagers. Teenagers don't really have freedom of speech in the way that adults do. Of course, we don't let them watch 18-rated films and things like that. I don't think that's particularly controversial. But I think what a lot of people are worried about is that, it starts with teenagers and then there's this bit of a slippery slope.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think I do worry about social media, I have to say. Never mind teenagers, I think adults spend too long on social media. One of the reasons I've never used X, or Twitter, as it used to be called, is because I don't want to get addicted to it as some people do, and they spend all their time on there. I do think these things have an impact on people's ability to concentrate. I don't think they are the cause of the crisis of concentration. I think that's a broader cultural question. It's a question of education and teaching kids to read, which happens less and less. And all those broader cultural issues need to be looked at first. But I do think probably social media culture exacerbates that by, feeding us these constant little snippets of news and snippets of video. And I do think that kind of distracts us from sitting down and reading a book. I mean, that's what I hear from friends of mine all the time, that they find it increasingly difficult to focus. So there are problems there, but all of Starmer's proposals won't do anything whatsoever to address those issues. I'm amazed at the extent to which the social media ban has become his big issue. It's the only thing he seems to talk about now. You've got people being killed on the streets of Britain, and you've got riots, and you've got all sorts going on, and he just says, "I'm going to ban social media. Don't worry, I'll do it." There could be a nuclear war, and he'd come out with a statement about social media for under 16s. It's ridiculous. I think the two issues with it is, first, that it seems to me to be unworkable. Kids are pretty good at getting around these things. That's the evidence from Australia. They'll just crack on. They'll find other ways to share their ideas, share their images, and so on. The idea of the state scouring kids' phones in some way, with AI or whatever it is, for nude images, that absolutely terrifies me. I think that's a really crazy idea, and there must be different ways in which we can control that problem. But I think the main issue, Fraser, as you say, is that their real thirst, their real urge is to control what us adults can see on social media. That's really what it comes down to. Children are being used as a shield, I think, to throw open social media to further and further state interference. That's what's happening. And that's been the role of children in censorship for all of time. They constantly, that old phrase, "Won't someone think of the children?" Censors have always used the excuse of vulnerable children to implement censorship that primarily impacts on adults. And that's what we're seeing here. And that's why they're talking about taking down fake news after something like the stabbing in Belfast, or removing misinformation, whether it's about Brexit or the European Union or immigration, whatever else it might be. This is about thought control. They want to control what people can see, what they can say, what opinions they can form. They think they are the dispensers of the ultimate wisdom, and the correct information, and everything else is potentially wrong, potentially dangerous, and potentially should be censored. So they're using children as an excuse to get to adults. And it's fundamentally political speech, especially dissenting speech, that they really want to control.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you do sort of wonder what ever happened to evidence-based policy. As you say, Brendan, the evidence from Australia is that the social media ban, certainly this blanket social media ban, doesn't work.
Yeah.
6 in 10 Australian under 16s are still using the social media sites that they're not allowed to do, that it's illegal for them to use. You think about also, it wasn't that long ago we implemented the Online Safety Act, which was supposed to turn the internet into a kind of child-friendly space. And, there's been some disastrous, instances of censorship that has created, that we've documented a lot on Spike. But also, clearly, the call for a ban on social media means that hasn't worked in the way that it's intended. So, yeah, well, Rakib, what do you make of this? I mean, this is clearly, at the very least, unworkable.
No, naturally, we want restrictions when it comes to hardcore content, where younger children may well get addicted to. It might also impact on the way they develop relationships further down the line. The way that young boys, for example, might view younger women. And I think also, in some ways, it sets hugely unrealistic, if not toxic, understandings of intimacy. For example, I think these are very important things that we should talk about. But Brendan's also right. I just think that I think the approach there is actually teaching and working with younger people, and actually talking frankly and openly about those kind of issues. It can't just be done by introducing blanket bans online. I think that, and as Brenda's also said, that younger people, they're very innovative and creative. They'll find ways to circumvent these restrictions. In that sense, they might be very motivated in terms of doing that. But I also think that there's also that risk of online safety measures ultimately masquerading, in terms of this politically motivated censorship. In that way, and I think that's obviously a very serious problem. And I think we've seen instances with that connected with the Online Safety Act, and I think that is a very serious problem. And I think that there needs to be a broader discussion in terms of, we're talking about, quite often it's young people we tend to focus on, but adult addiction to sort of or social media is also a very real thing that there's something that Brendan touched on. So I think there are ways to address certain problems in society. I think that in a way, social media bans, I think that they're hugely simplistic. In some ways, they're not workable, and they might not even achieve intended aims. But even worse, we talk about, this is ultimately about online safety, when in some cases it's clear that it's ultimately about clamping down on various forms of political dissent, which you don't want in our liberal democratic society. So all in all, I'm very skeptical of these kind of measures, not only in terms of their sort of effectiveness, but actually what they're actually designed for. Truly, if there are sort of, how would you say, alternative intentions behind them. So I think that's my general view on it. And I think we need to see examples in other countries in terms of how it hasn't worked so well. We shouldn't ignore those kind of international case studies when it comes to what you mentioned there, Fraser. Ultimately, what we want to promote is evidence-driven policy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rakib. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you to everyone watching at home. But that's not the end of our discussion. We will also be continuing on Spiked Podcast Unlocked, where we'll be talking about Islamopopulism, sectarianism, the Islamo left, all that good stuff, how the rise of Islam is affecting British democracy. So if you're a Spike supporter, we will see you there. If you're not a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now and you can listen to the rest of the discussion. Thank you so much for watching the Spike podcast. We'll be back next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the Spike podcast, then why not check out what else our channel has to offer, from our documentaries to our weekly interviews and podcasts like The Brendan O'Neill Show. And if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch the second half of this episode by logging in on the Spiked website. If you're not yet a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now? You'll get unlimited access to the website, ad-free reading, discounted tickets to our events, and so much more. So become a Spike supporter today by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support.